Today's episode, we're going to be talking about learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a situation in which an individual or an animal believes that a negative situation is unchangeable or inescapable.
Okay.
And this phenomenon and experiments came from the interest of Martin Seligman on depression. So he was a sociologist, psychologist that was interested in what really causes depression. And I don't think like his experiments were on dogs, and they were kind of a lucky discovery.
What do you mean by a lucky discovery? Like he didn't go in there with like a hypothesis or something?
He did,
what?
and his experiments that we're gonna talk about here about learned helplessness came from he started out classically conditioning dogs, and he was trying to figure out why they would become depressed or whatever, and then he seen this learned helplessness trait appear in them.
Okay.
So that's how it kind of started.
Is classic conditioning going to be relevant for the conversation we have today?
Yes, not much of it, but just the fact that the start of the experiment started out, he would ring a bell and at the same time shock the dog. And obviously the dogs, without being shocked, would kind of flinch when the bell rang.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where this learned helplessness came about, is that the dogs would kind of cower instead of actually trying to like yip around or run or whatever, right? They would just curl up.
But was that as the experiment continued? Like I imagine the first couple of times the dogs were shocked, they probably had like an aggressive kind of reaction to it.
Yes, yeah. But like I was saying, it was a lucky occurrence that happened, right? The whole experiment was not to what we're going to be talking about, I guess.
Okay.
If that makes sense at all. So after he found out that these dogs would be curling up in a ball, he put the dogs in a future experiment. He put the dogs in a box that had two sides with a barrier in the middle. One side, they had like panels on the floor, and one side would shock the dog, and all they had to do to escape the shock was jump over the barrier into the side that did not shock them.
Mm-hmm.
What they found is that the dogs that were conditioned with the bells would not jump over the barrier, but made no attempts to avoid the shocks. And this discovery is why where learned helplessness came from. So they had three groups of dogs. Group one, the dogs were strapped into a harness for a little and then released. So for part of their experiment, they couldn't do anything about the shocks, but then they could. The second group, they were strapped into the same harness and given electric shocks that could be turned off by pressing a button with their nose. The third group of dogs received same shocks as the second group, but they were not able to control it. And the box I was talking about before, I call it a shuttle box. And like before, one side produced an electric shock, and they would have to jump to the other side. What they found was that dogs in groups 1 and 2 both jumped over the barrier. The dogs in group 3 stayed in the shocking square and dealt with the shocks. So, yes, they were doing experiments and all that, but it's just interesting. And this, I think it was late 60s is when this experiment occurred. To me, I don't think I could shock a dog as part of an experiment.
Yeah, like I feel like this is probably a little bit controversial because there are a lot of people who will use like shock collars on their dogs to like train them in different ways, or they constantly have one on them to keep them within the boundaries of their like home or their farm. So I guess I'm wondering what the shock of this experiment is like compared to what the shocks are, like the intensity of the shocks in the experiment versus the kind of, easily accessible shock collars and things on the market.
I would assume that it would be a similar shock. Obviously, I don't think it's like permanently harming the dogs, I guess, besides mentally.
Yeah, I think that's where I just really struggle with the idea of experimenting with animals who aren't able to consent. It's one thing to do experiments with people when they're able to consent, or with animals when there's no potential harm that's going to come to them from the experiment. And I know some people might be like, well, the harm, like, it's not permanently damaging them, these shocks, or, but I don't know. Like, if someone put me in that experiment and I didn't know what was going on, like, that would have lifelong impacts on me for sure. And dogs are smart and have really great memories. And so I'm sure that participating in this kind of experiment would have really damaged
actually,
them.
I didn't look that up, but I wonder what the dogs were like after. Because you like those rescue dogs, they live through traumatic experiences, and they're like, you can tell that they've been hit and stuff like that, right?
And of course, I guess it depends, for how long were they in this experiment? How many shocks did each dog receive? Because maybe if it was just, 2 to 3 shocks, well, okay, weird experience for them, uncomfortable experience, but it's like maybe won't be as long-term or impacting. But if they were receiving like, 25, 50 shocks or more, like that would be, I think, devastating.
Well, the dogs developed an expectation that they couldn't do anything about the shocks. So I'm guessing it was more than 3 times.
Yeah, that must have been, that would have to be a lot of shocks to actually instill the idea
it's
of
painful. It's not like, I don't know, what would be a different example?
Well, irritating. It's painful, not just irritating.
Yes.
Like irritating would be every time you say a certain word on the podcast, I flick you with my pen. It might be a little bit annoying, and it might also in a way help you not say that word or something, but it's not painful. Painful would be like every time you say something, I stab you with the tip of a knife or something in your leg.
Yes.
Yeah.
Poor dogs.
Poor dogs. We love doggies.
So this third dog has learned helplessness. And although this happened in the 60s, there's been new studies that improved it, but it is something it's not something that's questioned really. We know it happens. And the same thing happens in humans. So I actually found a video on YouTube. It's from the 90s, and I'm going to put the link in the bio because I was actually quite interested in the video, and it's only about 6 minutes long. But a teacher induced learned helplessness in students in her, I'm assuming, psychology class. So the teacher used 3 anagrams, and that's like words you rearrange and form another word, right? So, and she split the classroom into 2 groups. One half, they had the first 2 anagrams were impossible to solve.
Okay.
The other half, they were extremely easy. These are just the first 2. And then the class went through the questions, and they had to raise their hand when they solved the anagram. So obviously had one half of the class, and I think the first one was like bad. So they switch to the tab, and they put their hand up, and it was like 5 seconds, and the whole half the class had it completed. The other half, they didn't solve it. Not a single hand went up. And then
So, sorry, just to confirm, these students all thought they had the same anagrams in each group.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
So then she said, okay, even though you guys can't solve it, let's move on to the next one. Maybe you can get this one.
Mm-hmm.
So they did. Again, they had half the class, and you could see now the half that had the impossible anagrams was looking at the other half. Oh my God, why can they figure it out? And they did that, and she's like, okay, we'll move on to the third one now. And the third one was the same for both groups. But you can see in the half of the classroom that had the easy words first, they had a less difficult time solving the anagram. And then the side that had the impossible ones still had trouble with the same anagram.
Because they just already had this sense of like, ugh, they're smarter than us. Like, we know this is going to be harder for us.
Well, I wouldn't say directly related to the other students, but they themselves believed that they couldn't solve, I guess, as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically, the teacher taught them learned helplessness. And then we'll circle back at the end of the episode here, because this example really relates to relationships and social settings. But we'll go into Seligman's theory a little more first.
Wait, I just want to go back to that. So she only did the 2 sets of anagrams, though?
Well, 3 rounds. There was 3 anagrams. One group had 2 hard ones, the other had 2 easy. The third one was the same.
Okay.
Right? And then one half that had the easy ones was still able to solve the anagram. The other half that had the difficult ones had more trouble.
Okay, but it was 3 like separate rounds then. So like they each got one anagram. One solved it, one didn't. Then they got the next round of anagrams. One solved it, one didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Then they got the third round. One solved it, one didn't.
Yep.
Okay. That needed to be clear, because to me, it sounded like it was just 2 rounds. One they didn't solve, and then the next one they were able to solve it. Because it's like that wouldn't... I don't see how doing 1 round of not solving something would then instantly make someone feel like, oh, I can't do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I guess it would be different for everyone, but it has to be learned, right? So